Okay, going back now and spending a little more time with each of the articles and giving you some of my opinion, I should say, about those articles. Article 1 was the principal thing that the United States was looking for, as I mentioned before. It was the primary purpose historically was to get the tribes to cede and convey title to the United States. The interesting thing about this was it was from a non-Indian perspective, it was from United States perspective, and from their opinion, Article 1 describes basically all of western Montana, best description to give it, as being lands of the Flathead, the Kootenai, and the Upper Pend Oreille. And the way they looked at it was from their perspective a territory that was exclusively used by these confederated tribes. What it misses, however, was the fact that we use lots of lands beyond these boundaries. That the best approximation was 22 to 24 million acres of land was used by these tribes. What's described in this treaty is basically 12 million acres of that land. So, for sake of conversation, roughly half of the lands that the tribes actively used were recognized in this treaty. And the thing to remember again, when you think about it or you talk about reservations that many people don't understand, is that, I'm repeating, but the United States did not give this land to us. We kept it. That's part of the title of the land, reservation. We reserved it. We kept it. So, in the same time that we talk about this, it's important to remember that not only did we keep that land that we're on today, but we kept as a part of that land other things that can best be described as activities, but as a lawyer would describe, easements upon the land. We kept estate in the land to do things. We kept the right of taking fish in usual and accustomed places. So wherever we historically fished, wherever we fished in streams, and as you can imagine, if you fish streams, you go all up and down the stream. So we kept a right to fish the streams in western Montana by this treaty, together with the right to hunt and gather on open and unclaimed lands. How that's been defined is that we have the right to do those activities of hunting, gathering, and pasturing our horses and cattle if we want, and getting berries, doing those things on open and unclaimed lands. The way that we most often think about that is on Forest Service lands in western Montana, but also in other areas of BLM lands, lands that are federal title, that are held that way. And there's always been debate about what can we do in the parks. But that might be a test for a later day, but I don't think anybody's going to object to us as natives gathering berries in the parks. And one of the more recent things that the National Park Service has done is if you are a member of these tribes and you have a tribal ID, you get into the national park for free, because that used to be ours. So think about it in the sense that those are reserved rights, and it's how a lawyer would talk about it. And however, as a part of Article 2, they had to survey out the current reservation, and the boundaries were described in the treaty by drainage lines principally. The high lines, all the highest points of the Mission Range are part of the treaty line. And the latitude going across the lake, so the southern half of the lake is ours. But it was described kind of by watershed. But when they surveyed it, they left off a portion of the treaty where the Flathead Lake lets the water into Flathead River and the other waters of the reservation come together, forming the Flathead River. As it goes to meet the Clark Fork, the original boundary was supposed to be at the intersection of the Clark Fork River and the Flathead River. So their erroneous survey left off approximately 10 to 11,000 acres of land. And so we sued the United States over that. You didn't give us all of the land that was supposed to be our reservation. And of course, many times the tribes didn't really get to that point until the 60s and in the 70s. But the court agreed that there was an erroneous survey. And the court found that the United States should pay the tribes money. And for years, the tribes asked for the land to be returned. And the tribes asked for the land that was in federal status, not for the land that non-Indians had settled on or homesteaded or whatever out of that portion. They just wanted back the federal lands that were within that era. However, that did not happen. And later in times, and when negotiations kept breaking down in Congress over whether or not we could get title to those federal lands, the leadership in the 80s, early 80s, the tribal leadership decided to take the money. They took the money with the intent of taking that money to buy land back that was within the current boundaries of the reservation. That was the intent. So that was part of Article 2, and so there was an error in boundary. We got the land for that error in boundary. The other part of Article 2 that's real interesting is that it was for the exclusive use and benefit of the tribe. And the treaty document itself says, nor shall any white man excepting those employed by the government be allowed on the reservation. So at that time, supposedly in good faith from the United States, they were to keep all non-Indians off the reservation because it was for the tribes. It was a part of forwarding the belief with the tribal people that this was to be our home forever, our permanent tribal homeland. Another section that I'll talk about briefly, and hopefully I won't get too sidetracked, it said even though it was for the exclusive use of the tribes had agreed that other, quote, other friendly Indians could be allowed to live on the reservation. And that gets important because 50 years later, the United States wants to count Indians. And it was essentially a census, and they called it the 1905 Original Rolls. And what they did was they counted all the Indians on the reservation. So when you go back to this language, all of the Indians that they counted everybody. So it wasn't just Flathead, Kootenai, and Upper Pend Oreille they counted Crees, they counted Shoshones, they counted Nez Perce, they counted other Indians other than our tribal members, and from that point on, they became tribal members. I myself am a Heinz 57. I have 7 different types of Indian blood in me. But what gets counted is the Flathead blood or the Salish blood, not all of those other bloods. And that gets into a whole different other issue that as young people you might want to think about, is that Native Americans are the only people in the United States that have pedigrees. We know exactly how much Native American we are for that particular tribe. Maybe not in total, but for that tribe. We have tribal IDs that say our enrollment number and how much we are. And we don't ask other folks, other peoples, other races, how much of that race they are. But I think it begins with this treaty, opens the door for that to begin to happen. Okay, Article 3, as we get back to it. We're back. We're live. We're back. Article 3. Article 3, most people think about it in the sense, what's most litigated about Article 3 is hunting and fishing rights. I think the primary thing I should mention is that on reservation we have the exclusive right of fishing together with hunting. And so because of that right, when you see people fishing on the reservation, they're fishing through a license privilege from the tribe. Or at least that's how their fishing activity should be. They should have a tribal permit to engage in that activity, because otherwise that's our exclusive right. As a part of this, think about it in the sense that we, the tribes, if we really wanted to push it, could put up no trespassing signs and say no fishing, because that's our exclusive right. It gets debated by people principally when the streams go through private property that's not owned by the tribe. And I'd say, so what? Don't worry about that battle. Prohibit it on the land that the tribe owns. No trespassing. So that's essentially what we're saying as a tribe with hunting and fishing. However, we're saying you can trespass to fish and to hunt birds if you have our license, if you have our permit. Otherwise, we're saying without that, it's no trespassing. So that's kind of the way to think about it. But because of Article 3, we have that right. That guaranteed our right to preclude others from engaging in that activity on our permanent homeland. The other thing about that is that what it also did was it excluded others from regulating our activity. The state of Montana got real intrusive with tribes not just Montana, states all across the board for a while were very intrusive in Indian country on almost all reservations. And the thing here was that as a part of being intrusive, they got into trying to manage our fisheries, our big game. They began to think they knew better than the tribes, or they knew better than the feds. So Montana, as an experiment, introduced some antelope on the Flathead River. The interesting thing about this story is, as a part of the antelope were there, we had a tribal member go out and shoot a couple antelope. Hey, they're on the reservation, we have the right to hunt. Took a couple antelope. Well, the state of Montana said, well, those aren't Indian antelope. Now, I guess they weren't wearing feathers, I don't know, but they weren't the tribe's antelope. And so they charged him with illegally hunting antelope on the Flathead Reservation. And the state courts, of all things, said, guess what, state of Montana, you're wrong. They have the exclusive right to do that, and we don't care if you put those antelope there. There was no tribal law saying they can't hunt antelope, and he killed antelope. So he had basically the bare right to hunt. That included the antelope that you put out there for him to take. So guess what, Montana, you don't get to regulate hunting by tribal members on the reservation. So it's not just that. The Article 3, beyond our off-reservation hunting rights, which I'll get to shortly, gave us also the right to manage that. One of the overall things to remember from the Treaty of Hellgate, it was a nation to nation. It recognizes our sovereignty. And a part of the document is saying, you have the sovereign authority to enter into a treaty, you have the sovereign authority to regulate your lands. So it doesn't specifically say that as such, but the document, by the mere nature of it on a sovereign-to-sovereign basis, recognizes that nation-to-nation status and the authority of that nation to regulate its lands. So sovereignty is recognized early on in 1855 and still recognized and debated today. How much sovereignty do we have? Well, it's like a muscle. The more you exercise it, the more of it you can claim. You got to exercise that muscle to use it. We have to exercise our sovereignty to protect it. So the other portion of Article 3, we've talked on reservation. Now let's talk off reservation. I talked about the right to fish in usual and accustomed places. and the right to hunt on open and unclaimed land. We have a case of a tribal member who was hunting white-tailed deer west of the reservation, down in the Thompson Falls area, to be exact, to kind of give you an idea, killed a couple of deer, was cited by the game warden, state game warden, for shooting deer out of season, I believe was the charge back at that time, or without a license. Either way, he was charged with illegally hunting. But based upon our right that we retained to hunt on open and unclaimed land, and again, the Montana Supreme Court said, in a case we refer to as the Stasso case, recognized our right to hunt off the reservation on open and unclaimed land. And we are probably one of the most active tribes in the nation of exercising our off-reservation rights. Today, you might think about it in the sense of another agreement that we use a lot, and that's to hunt buffalo. It partly comes from this, but it also comes from another treaty that I'm not discussing today, but it's our right to hunt off the reservation, open and unclaimed land, and that's been upheld. Now, but the thing to remember is we have the right to hunt off the reservation, but it is subject to how our tribe sets up the rules to do that. Our nation prescribes, develops, and writes from a management basis how we exercise our off-reservation rights. An example is a moose is a limited population of wildlife. And to hunt moose, we tribal members have to get a tribal permit to hunt moose off the reservation. Actually, that permit now has been that we need that on and off. So as far as hunting moose, we need to have a moose permit to hunt moose, in particular, off the reservation. So a part of talking about these things, and then you start to have to interpret the articles together somewhat, and you think about that we have the exclusive use of the land, we have the right to regulate activities upon the land, that's Article 3, and so we use this document, and it's part of why we call this document a living document, because if we get into a debate about who has the right to regulate fishing, we have to go back to this title document to say, here it is, and this is our right to do it. This is our land. And as we talk about Article 2, I'm going back to Article 2 now for a different intent, because Article 2 at this stage, when we're talking about it in the late 1800s, said, nor shall any white man be allowed to live on the reservation. And we talked about the survey and how there was an erroneous survey done. And so that's out of Article 2 as well. But then along comes this idea of making us farmers and ranchers. And the thing about it was when that idea came to us from the Dawes Allotment Act process, the Dawes Act, the General Land Allotment Act, the idea was to give heads of families 160 acres, give family members 80 acres of land, and then they would therefore begin to put plow to soil and horses and cows in there. The interesting thing about that is in the early 1900s on this reservation, there were over 20,000 head of horses, and there were roughly 26,000 head of cattle that were being managed on this reservation by the tribal membership at the time. And because of the influence of the Jesuit fathers, there were some families that were already engaging in farming activity, or at a minimum growing family gardens. Family gardens were big. And it was that introduction. There were members that were engaging in that, as from the instruction from the Jesuits or whoever brought that. But it was a natural. Indians had horse herds long before cattle got here. And so Indian people had been managing their horse herds for a long time, is the best way to put it. People debate how long the era of the horse and the Plains Indian lasted, but let's say a century of time was there where Indians managed their horse herds. And that took grazing practices. That took management of the land. And this is an aside, but this Flathead Nation in particular, out of the Confederated Tribes, had a practice of burning the ranges. And part of it was to improve the range for buffalo and elk, but also for the horses. So there was a practice of burning the range so that you would get more grass coming back in the next grazing season. So natives were doing that. So it was kind of a natural then to just add cattle to the horses. Much of the practice was the same. And since we couldn't go hunt the buffalo, or we could go hunt the buffalo, but they weren't as plentiful as they used to be, so now we had cattle. So when they were talking about making us farmers and ranchers, from that sort of definition, we were already ranchers. We were raising horses and we were raising cattle and we were prosperous. And most families were doing well. And if you go back historically, families took care of families. And so nobody was going hungry. Nobody was being left out. We were taking care of our own. And I think we need to sometimes grasp onto that theme of taking care of our own. We need to do that yet today. Maybe it's a different basis, but we need to continue that practice. So this is a step away from the treaty, but this is one of the first major violations of this treaty, is the General Land Allotment Act. And when I talked about counting Indians on the reservation, the reason they counted Indians on the reservation was to set up allotments. Now, the tribes, they tried to get the tribes to accept the allotment process early on, late 1800s. There were meetings in 1902, 1901. And because the tribes here resisted it, in the eminent wisdom of Congress, of senators, of politicians who wanted land that we had, they passed our very own Allotment Act, the Flathead Indian Allotment Act of 1904. That act called for a census to be taken of the Indians. Now, we already talked about which Indians were here, but all of the Indians that got counted under the Flathead Indian Allotment Act got allotments. Head of households down to babies. Everybody who was on the tribal rolls, counted as part of the tribal membership, got allotments. Now, the thing about that is everybody got a tract of land, but the law allowed for, if there were surplus lands left over, then the reservation could be opened up to non-Indian homesteading. So we had our own kind of mini Oklahoma Sooners land rush here of homesteaders coming onto the reservation, but it was like lands off of, I mean, you see pictures of where people went to mercantiles and the government agents were there, and they were giving out allotments, homesteads. When I say allotments, they were allotting land out to homesteaders. They were allowing, the first major violation of the treaty, non-Indians to move in on our lands. It gets difficult when you think about it, because from the period of 1905 to 1910, you had these successful ranchers that had to liquidate, sell out their assets so that they could maintain what they had on small parcels of land. My great-grandfather, as I was told by my grandmother, went to Canada with over 200 head of horses because he never had the land anymore to run those horses. And at the same time, took cattle to a market in Kalispell that was so flooded they were basically giving their livestock away. So the United States basically forced successful ranchers out of business. And it just, with the idea of making us more prosperous. So It was exactly the opposite of making us more prosperous. And then in 1910, there was a declaration to open the reservation to non-Indian homesteaders, and it was a giveaway of our land. That's what it was. It was a violation of the treaty, a giveaway of our land. And I've heard people say, well, that was so long ago. And I'd say, yeah, but you might come from a family that's handed down the same land for multiple generations. We lost that. The tribal membership lost those lands to give them to future generations. They were taken from us. The bright light since then is that after the allotment process of 1910 and 1922, the tribes only retained roughly a third of the size of the reservation. Today, the tribes own nearly 70% of the reservation because the tribes have bought back land that was basically stolen from us. Now, we went to court with one court of claims case, and the court said, you're right, the land was stolen, it was taken from you, and we will pay you for that. But we'll pay you for the value of the land in 1910. And I think the first case was like 97 cents an acre. Crazy. And look at it today. I would rather have that land today than that 97 cents per acre. However, that was the first major violation of our treaty. Comes from that section. Article 4, I'm not going to spend much time with. We talked about it already. It was appropriations to move Indians. And the interesting thing was $36,000 was appropriated back in 1855 or 1859 upon the ratification of the treaty to move Indians. Now, $36,000 might have been a lot of money back then. I guess that's basically 150 years ago or 160 years ago now. So, but the money sounds small, but obviously part of the intent was to get title to the land, and with Article 4, it makes clear that the intent was to move us off of the Bitterroot Valley. And my family on my dad's side has ties to the Burnt Fork of the Bitterroot, and later being forcefully moved. That's another story to come at the end of this conversation, I guess, or toward the end of this conversation. The Article 5 talked about, it's kind of interesting because the purpose there was health, education, welfare, and that the United States was going to take care of us, right? The great white father back east was going to take care of us. They were going to educate us. It talks about blacksmiths. It talks about employing instructors. It talks about doing those things. Well, the United States was not living up to that obligation. So what did the United States do? They came up with a different plan. While we're civilizing those Indians, maybe we need to Christianize those Indians. And so many reservations across the West, religious denominations were giving grants of land. And on our reservation that happened as well. There was a grant of land given to the Jesuit fathers with acreage with it to support the purposes of the fathers educating young Indian boys, providing religious education to the Indians, and sufficient acreage to provide for, along with that, as a part of that instruction, agricultural instruction. And we started to talk about it as the Father's Boys School, the Jesuit Boys School. In the old pictures, you can see the old boarding school for Indian boys from the reservation here that was situated just north of the present-day Catholic Church. In addition to that, then a land grant was given to the Ursuline nuns to educate Indian girls. They got a land grant for the purposes of supporting that school for as long as the Ursuline nuns educated Indian girls. The third part of that, so then we get education, now healthcare. So then the United States adds the Sisters of Charity of the Catholic Church to it, and The Ursuline nuns were teachers. The Sisters of Charity were health care. They were nurses. They were educated. Some of them were doctors. But the Sisters of Charity were given a land grant. And as a part of that land grant, the Sisters of Charity were to build a hospital. That was the promise of the United States in that Article 5, was that they would erect a hospital and provide doctors and provide medicine. Well, the Sisters of Charity were given land from our reservation for the purposes of supporting that. Of course, that was already their calling. Their calling as a part of the Catholicism was to provide health care. Their calling was to educate. That was part of their calling as a part of the church, but the church then got lands to support that calling of those, I guess it's orders, is what they refer to it in the Catholic Church. There was the Order of Nuns, Ursuline, the Order of the Sisters of Charity, and the Jesuits. So that's how that promise was to be fulfilled, was by giving land to those denominations. Now, it came with an interesting quirk, and it was when they ceased to use the land for that purpose, the land was to revert back to the tribe. Now, it didn't quite work. Can't quite trust those Jesuits, because they decided they quit educating Indian boys. There was an agreement where the Ursuline nuns had a dormitory built for the boys. And so then all of a sudden the Ursuline nuns were providing all of the education. With that, the Jesuits tore down the boys' school in the early 1960s. At the time that was done, then, they were running a ranch and a small herd of milk cows, and they no longer needed that as a part of feeding the boys and of providing that. And they were actually running a cattle ranch at the time, and they decided to sell it. And that's what they did. They didn't give it back to the tribe. They sold it. This caused then a court case of the tribes, and the tribe said, "No, that's not right. You're supposed to give it back." And the courts agreed. The courts ordered the Catholic Church to return the land. And it was a quirk. The Catholic Church, one of the richest institutions in the world, they could have afforded to buy it back. They were over a barrel, obviously, because they had to buy it back by court order, but they sent the poor parishioners, the local people, to the tribal council meeting to beg the tribal council to just accept what they got for selling the land. And the tribal council, feeling sorry for those two old priests that were in there, not recognizing that they were from one of the richest organizations in the world that could afford to pay for it, they've seen them as the poor father that was at Mass at the Jocko Church in the Jocko Valley with a small delegation. The father that was at St. Ignatius at 8 o'clock Mass. That's who they seen. And they said, okay, we'll take the money. So today, those lands are in non-Indian ownership. Some of them have passed to others. But we should have had those lands back. That's how it was. The church. So the United States didn't live up to the treaty obligation. They used the church to comply with one of the treaty obligations, and the church, being the Catholic Church, didn't live up to the agreement that they had either. So my point is while it's a living document and it's been very helpful at times, it's the saying, great men like great nations should honor their word. And that's, many times you might hear me say, well, the nation didn't honor their word, and that's how it hurt us. Okay, we talked about survey into lots, Article 6, Article 7, that none of the money to implement the treaty would be used by individuals to pay their own bills and debts. Article 8 was that, and I'm going through these relatively quick, because Article 8 it was that the tribes acknowledged that they were dependent upon the United States. The other part of Article 8, I guess, is that Article 8 created a situation where the tribes that signed on agreed not to war with other tribes, agreed not to protect other tribes who might be warring against the United States, agreed that we wouldn't fight with one another. And as nations and protecting territories, we had to protect our territories from other natives that time. But that provision was to say we couldn't do that. We were to be peaceful with other native nations. We were not to assist those that were at war with other native nations. And Article 9 was to keep the ardent spirits off the reservation. Well, it worked pretty good until you let those dastardly non-Indians on the reservation, because they didn't come on the reservation to homestead without their spirits. You know, that's a part of who they are. I can't culturally say that's wrong. So all of a sudden there was no way to control alcohol on the reservation when you opened the doors to a population that imbibes in the spirits. Let's see here. The survey, Article 11, it never happened, and I wanted to come back to that one because the survey, we already talked about the erroneous survey out of Article 2, but the survey here out of Article 11 was a survey of the Bitterroot Valley. It didn't happen. And as you read journals and things of the time, 15 years had gone by. So we're talking 1870. And at that time, the Flatheads in the Bitterroot thought, okay, this is our reservation because we haven't heard anything. Nobody's said anything. They never heard anything about a survey. The major assumption with the Bitterroot Salish was, this is our homeland. We're here. Well, no. So there's pressure because you already have gold mining in Montana. You have gold mining in Illinois. You have mining in Butte. And we still have those dastardly Indians living in the Bitterroot Valley. And one of the richest men in the world, Marcus Daly, he loved the Bitterroot Valley. So what happens? Then we get what we refer to as the 1872 agreement. The 1872 removal agreement. It was essentially a negotiation or attempt to contract with the Bitterroot Salish to move from the Bitterroot Valley. It's an offshoot of this treaty, the 1872 agreement. Now, what happened was they came out and they got some signatories, but our main leader, Charlo, at the time said, nope, not signing that document, not going there. This is our home. We're staying there. And so the Bitterroot Salish, from their perspective, didn't agree to the 1872 document. Some signatories signed, however, and this was pushed forward by President Grant. Grant had, as I understood it, political favors to fulfill, and he was a big push for getting the Salish out of the Bitterroot. So that didn't happen. So the Salish didn't move. So in 1891, there was a forced removal of the Salish from the Bitterroot Valley. And that's not that long ago. That when you think about history and you think about time, that really was not that long ago. That was obviously, from anybody's perspective, a theft of the Bitterroot Valley. It was never surveyed as agreed. And Article 11, no survey. The United States again didn't live up to the document, and they forcefully removed the tribes. Although the very last article, Article 12, says this treaty shall be obligatory upon all of the contracting parties. The contracting party that didn't live up to the document, out of 4 parties, the United States. So I'm not sure what else to add. I wanted to, I think, as a small part of this, say, while the treaty talks about land and talks about rights, I want to go back to the sovereignty thing. There's a responsibility with this. And tribal government has advanced far beyond this at this time in terms of how I guess we think about it today. But we need to remember that this document is solid. It's the supreme law of the land. And anybody who says they believe in the Constitution of the United States, if they truly believe in the Constitution of the United States, they have to believe in the commitments that were made in this treaty document. And Article 10, to protect us from the Hudson Bay Fur Company. Well, we go over Post Creek Hill and we see Fort Connell all the time, and that's, I have to admit, it's part of my family roots, comes from the good old Scots. So history teaches us a lot about people. It teaches about great nations honoring their word. And while some people say, well, why didn't you help Joseph? This is one of those provisions of saying great men, like great nations, will honor their word. And they honored that provision. So we can debate it how you want, but the tribes lived up to their side of the bargain, and that's part of why I go to that. The Salish, Kootenai, and Pend Oreille lived up to their side of the bargain, and look how many times the United States had violated their side of the bargain. And with that, thank you.